Good evening. I'm Chuck Rybak, and thank you for joining us for our second episode of No Reservations, a conversation series designed to provide a forum for sharing bold, challenging, and provocative ideas. We are coming to you live from UW Green Bay's Fort Howard Hall at the Weidner Center for the Performing Arts. And as always, thank you to Kelly Strickland and her staff for letting us use this beautiful space. Dr. Alise Coen is Associate Professor of Political Science in the Public and Environmental Affairs Unit of UW Green Bay. She earned her PhD in Political Science from the University of Delaware and her BA in International Relations from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her research focuses on refugees, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy and has been published in journals such as Ethics and International Affairs, Politics and Religion, International Relations, and the International Journal of Human Rights. She is currently writing a book about U.S. refugee responsibility sharing. Professor Coen will give a brief talk titled When Policy Becomes Identity, Narratives in U.S. Refugee Policy, and then we will move to the question and answer portion. So if you're viewing online, please post any questions that you have in the chat, and we will do our best to get to those. And without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alise Coen.
Thank you all for joining me. Tonight I'm talking with you about refugee policy and identity and narratives. What do I mean by narratives? Narratives make sense of who we are, what we stand for, and what we are threatened by. I'll now ask you to imagine a debate, a speech, or even a tweet thread about a fiercely contested policy issue. Someone is advocating for the policy because it supports our values as a society, or reflects the principles our nation was founded on. Or perhaps they are opposed to the policy because it's at odds with who we are as a country, or because it betrays what we stand for. Do these kinds of statements sound familiar to you? Perhaps you can remember hearing them or even saying them in a discussion about politics. Maybe you connected with the power of the emotions behind them, our values, our principles, what we stand for. These can be powerful cues for feelings of pride, feelings of belonging, feeling like you are part of something much bigger than yourself. Maybe you remember feeling manipulated by these phrases and skeptical of how they were being used. Or maybe these statements seem unimportant, like they're just words, so how much do they really matter? It might be easy to think of language as a means to an end in the policy world. Words are meant to show some kind or prompt some kind of political action, so why not just skip right to the action part? But if we slow down, if we pause and tune into the way that words are used, we can learn a great deal. It is through language that policymakers and other political actors represent the world and make sense of different policy problems and options. The words that we use condition our expectations of what is possible, dangerous, appropriate, even moral. In my own research, I've studied how statements about our values, our principles, who we are as a country, what we stand for, create meaning around refugee policy. I've been especially fascinated by the ways that policymakers use language to embed refugee policy positions within identity narratives. If you allow me to take you back in time a few years to the 2015-2016 US election cycle, you might remember Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were presidential candidates. You might also remember that the conflict and humanitarian emergency in Syria were intensifying. Syria's neighboring countries, such as Turkey and Lebanon, were hosting millions of refugees fleeing violence, torture, and harm in their home country. With the vast majority of Syrian refugees being hosted by countries within the region, there were global calls for wealthier countries like the United States to more equitably share in the responsibility to offer safety to displaced Syrians. For decades, US policymakers around the world were celebrated the US status as a so-called leader in the international refugee regime. And indeed, refugee resettlement worldwide became heavily dependent on US contributions. But in the wake of Syrian displacement, the refugee admissions program within the United States became fiercely contested in domestic politics. You might remember Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump debating refugee resettlement But the policy debate extended far beyond presidential candidates. Shortly after the November 2015 Paris attacks, for which ISIS claimed responsibility, a number of bills were proposed in Congress to pause or halt all Syrian refugee admissions. These bills included the SAFE Act of 2015, endorsed by then Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. The language surrounding these bills defined Syrian refugees as threatening and dangerous. Republican campaign ads also focused on Syrian refugee resettlement to attack Democratic policy positions. For the first time in the history of the U.S. refugee resettlement program, a large movement of individual states with Republican governors sought to block Syrian refugees from being resettled in their jurisdictions. As measures against Syrian and Muslim refugee resettlement intensified, Governor Jay Inslee, a Democrat in Washington, compared the restrictive refugee policy approach to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, claiming it wasn't consistent with who we are as a country. Similarly, Democratic presidential contender Bernie Sanders underscored welcoming refugees as part of safeguarding America's moral core, declaring we will do what we do best, and that is be Americans, fighting racism, fighting xenophobia, fighting fear. Around the same time, the president of FAIR, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, spoke in favor of then-candidate Trump's 2015 proposal for a, quote, shutdown of Syrian and Muslim refugees and immigrants into the United States, on the basis that those refugees might radically alter the American way of life with beliefs fundamentally at odds with the values and freedom in our Constitution. Similar logics were echoed across conservative lawmakers like Representative Louis Gohmert of Texas, who argued that it's okay to discriminate against so-called Syrian refugees because they might destroy our way of life, bring down our government, destroy Western civilization, or bring down our Constitution. We can see across these statements that policies to protect and welcome or block and ban refugees were fused with ideas of who we are as a country, what it means to be American, with ideas of protecting the American way of life, safeguarding Western civilization, and protecting the values of our Constitution. Refugee resettlement was not only conceived as a matter of policy debate, but as a matter of identity. The fundamental meaning of America was at stake. This debate about Syrian refugee resettlement and the fundamental meaning of America was largely fractured along partisan and ideological identity lines. But this had not always been the case. The 2016 election cycle was a particularly pivotal moment for the intersection of policy and identity regarding refugee resettlement. In the decades before that election, resettlement was surprisingly intersubjective among national policymakers, meaning there was a commonsensical notion that refugee admissions supported U.S. foreign policy interests, the U.S. as a leader in global politics, a reflection of America's moral virtues, and even humanitarian hegemony. U.S. refugee responsibility sharing had spanned Democratic and Republican administrations, and some of the highest refugee admission ceilings were established with Republican policymakers at the helm, including President George H.W. Bush. I also found in my research some of the most vocal advocates for refugee resettlement included conservative and Republican lawmakers, such as Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas. Refugee admissions were selective and skewed to prioritize certain groups, but both Republicans and Democrats co-created narratives in which the refugee resettlement program made sense. Identity narratives are really good at making sense of things, reconciling what might seem like significant contradictions from the outside to create cohesive maps of reality from the inside. Identity narratives shape what people believe to be true, unquestionable, what premises could be unconsciously taken for granted as common sense in navigating the world. In studying the discourse around refugees in the decades prior to the 2016 elections, I found a kind of common sense about refugee resettlement across Republican and Democratic policymakers, and the common sense was supported by collective stories about what America means. Justifications of refugee resettlement often emerged in narratives oriented around providential exceptionalism. This is the notion that the United States had a divinely ordained mission in the world, or as Ronald Reagan put it in his 1980 acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, that the U.S. had a divine providence placed on this land. This island of freedom, here is a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe freely. Justifications for refugee policy were also embedded in narratives oriented around anti-communist mirror images, contrasting American freedom and godliness with communist oppression and godlessness. Visions of America as Western, industrious, and self-sufficient. After the Cold War ended, policymakers from both parties instrumentalized refugee resettlement to build images of the United States as a global role model in human rights, images which often justified interventionist foreign policies. Refugee resettlement made sense in bipartisan logics as a vehicle for reflecting the best attributes of U.S. foreign policy, the moral virtues of American values, as being a kind of savior, a selective savior to the oppressed. And I think we can see these themes across these very similar images of American policymakers pictured with refugee children, from President Clinton to Vice President Nixon and Senator Ted Kennedy, across different decades. As the 2016 elections approached, however, any consensus or commonsensical view of refugee resettlement among policymakers visibly broke down. Most strikingly, it broke down along the lines of partisan and ideological identity. Republican and Democratic candidates running for office, governors and lawmakers within Congress and state legislatures were increasingly using refugees to curate different answers to those fundamental identity narrative questions: who we are, what we stand for, and what we are threatened by. Previously conservative and Republican voices of support for admitting Syrian refugees, such as Senator Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, John Kasich, Senator Lindsey Graham, altered or went silent. Through the language of identity narratives, being Republican or conservative became equivocated with opposing Syrian refugee resettlement. Republican identity narratives made sense of this opposition by framing it to mean safeguarding the most vulnerable aspects of American culture from dangerous foreigners who wish to do harm. We can see an example here with Representative Trey Gowdy of South Carolina. He was arguing in favor of the SAFE Act in 2015 in the language of defending American values. Quote, "It is against the values of our nation and the values of a free society to give terrorists the opening they are looking for, to come into our country and harm the American people." At the same time, being liberal or democratic was equivocated with welcoming Syrian refugees and thereby safeguarding America's inclusive moral core as a protector of the vulnerable, America's Statue of Liberty ethos. As Representative Jerry Nadler of New York said in arguing against the SAFE Act, to stop thousands of desperate people who are fleeing unspeakable violence is unconscionable. We might as well take down the Statue of Liberty. These diverging partisan and ideological identity narratives around refugees were codependent, constantly responding to one another. Syrian refugee images were constructed and reconfigured to critique and condemn partisan and ideological opponents. After the 2016 elections, legal changes were solidified to block Syrian and other refugee admissions into the United States. Travel bans and dramatic cuts to refugee resettlement ceilings continue to be justified or opposed through some of the identity narratives that were established during the election cycle. So there are a couple of things you might take away from this. First, layered within the multi-causal story of U.S. refugee policy, there are complex identity stories, stories we tell ourselves about who we are as a country, what we value, and these make sense of the policies. These stories are not singular or unitary, but they are splintered and fragmented along partisan, ideological, and other identity lines that make sense of refugee policies in disparate ways. I also hope you might take away a heightened awareness of how decision makers speak about policies in ways that cue our belonging within a particular group and our vision of ourselves as part of something bigger in order to generate our support or our opposition. If those arguments are being made in terms of who we are, what we stand for, what we are threatened by, it might be that our policy position has or is becoming part of our identity, and the implications of that can be quite powerful for how we see the world. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Alise. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dean Rybak.
So I had a whole list of questions that I wanted to ask you, and then I listened to you talk, and I want to tear all of those up and go into different places. So I guess I'll just start with just something introductory, just to let people know, like, sort of what brought you to this. So what did bring you to this as a, as a concern, something that you would want to pursue on a scholarly level, and so why this?
So this topic, really looking at the 2016 election cycle, I was piqued by this because the main argument within the scholarly literature to explain U.S. refugee responsibility sharing focuses always on U.S. foreign policy interests as the core driver. And what I found was that foreign policy interests didn't really align with which groups we were accepting and resettling, and which groups were being turned away or demonized even. So it seemed to me that there was a lot more than quote unquote foreign policy interests, but it was more how those interests were being interpreted. How are we making sense of what interests are? And in general, I think I've just always been fascinated by any sort of identity questions and how we make sense of things.
And so I'm already going to go off script. I'm sorry already. It was interesting to, talking about this on a linguistic level, and so I come from a literary background. Language and symbols and systems of symbols are really important to me. And during your talk, you pointed to what seemed to be a unity of narrative over time, and then a divergence in that narrative. Do you have any thoughts about what has caused that divergence, and in a linguistic way, even?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think refugee resettlement was able to stay somewhat insulated from immigration, quote unquote immigration, where people think of undocumented migrants or the southern border with Mexico. These overseas refugees that were linked with foreign policy could stay somewhat insulated and keep that bipartisan consensus because partisan polarization had not fully taken hold of it. So I think the story of understanding the identity narrative change is really also a story about partisan polarization, which for me, the work I find most interesting on partisan polarization is how that is embedded in identity, how the words we use make Democrats and Republicans enemies, and through those kinds of cues where we dehumanize partisan opponents, then once we tether an issue to, well, the opposing side supports that, then it becomes very hard to have anything intersubjective, anything commonsensical across the aisle, so to speak.
And the partisan difference then, I hear you saying, is linguistic, that the linguistics of it are inseparable from identity, that it determines that people are taking not just a different ideological path, they're taking a different linguistic path that informs that.
Right, that is really well put, because I think identities are discursively reproduced. How do we conceive of who we are, or what we stand for, or what we are threatened by? It is through language that we can represent and make sense of those things. So as soon as someone says, well, this is a liberal cause, then right away people that would identify in their own social attachment to being a conservative, or being a Republican, or maybe like an evangelical Christian would be cued. Oh, that's my enemy, right? And they will have a filter of how they're seeing that policy issue. Maybe they don't even have strong views on, or could potentially feel the opposite, of what they're being cued to feel.
Yeah, that the language is a path that's laid out for you to follow. We will now spend the next hour talking about denotation and connotation. So how would you used the term American exceptionalism, which is something that comes up quite a bit. How would you assess that as a term, as a phrase, American exceptionalism, like as a belief system that intersects with what you're talking about?
Yeah, I do see that one repeatedly, and a lot of historians that do research on this kind of topic have also noticed that. It's this sense that we are the shining city upon the hill, that iconography that really goes back to the American Revolution, and it's heavily intertwined with the Protestant ethic because it's also very religious. There's a religious fervor to it, that the United States has a mission in the world. We have a calling. We are serving something more than just politics. We are serving this kind of like God-given mission to be a protector and a beacon of hope, to be a refuge to freedom seekers, defending freedom everywhere. The thing with providential exceptionalism is it's really malleable. So it can shift. It can, at times, it has been used in a way that says, well, who is America? Oh, by the way, it's a white Christian nation, of course, and it will remain and should remain homogenous, and then all the exceptionalist language. But at other times, it's actually been used to have this more welcoming Statue of Liberty, ethos, that we are the beacon on the hill, so we accept all these oppressed people seeking freedom in our arms.
Yeah, to me, it sort of vacillates between ambition, that it's a good thing to be a group of people to want to go and help other people, right? But then also, there's almost, there's no middle, there's a childishness almost that we're the greatest, like you have a foam finger or something, we're number one, and that's the extent of it. And so there's a question coming in from David Corey, who we know, and again, if you're out there and you're watching, feel free to post questions in the chat. And Professor Curry asks, increasingly, politicians speak of our Judeo-Christian values. To what degree do you see the change in attitudes toward refugees as one that is rooted in Islamophobia and fear of non-Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question from Dr. Curry. In thinking about continuity and change, that's one of the things that's most challenging to grapple with in any kind of project where you're trying to explain narratives and identity over time. But I think that's been one of the enduring, sort of deeply rooted genealogies of all of this is, as Edward Said would say in Orientalism, this perception of all that is associated with Islam, the Muslim world, as being backwards, inferior, a colonial mindset. And there is this current theme that stretches across decades of immigration and refugee policy, where when there are fears that the group will threaten our values or who we are as a nation, it's sort of implicitly coded as a white Christian, or now, more recently, white Judeo-Christian. So Muslim is cast as permanently inassimilable, that the Muslim identity itself cannot be reconciled with integrating or assimilating into the American way of life. And so, yeah, that's a recurring thing I've found.
And so I imagine that's connected to, like, thinking linguistically again, just not Sharia as a concept, but as a word, that you would be against that and see it as threatening and have no idea what that means. Is that rooted in the same thing?
Absolutely, and that's great that you would pick up on Sharia law as something, a linguistic cue for this, because I showed the audience the Representative Louis Gohmert comment where he was saying these refugees and Muslim immigrants could threaten our Constitution. And when he goes on later in that speech, he actually brings up making our Constitution submissive to Sharia law. So that is something that is constantly there, that as some of these lawmakers will talk about why Muslim groups of refugees are threatening, they will have almost a conspiracy view that was similar to the view held of Catholics in the 1800s, that they would try and replace the King James Bible with some sort of Catholic teachings. Now this fear that Muslim migration will be replacing the Judeo-Christian civilization with submission to Sharia law, again, without really understanding Sharia law.
And it's interesting to frame it as just the possibility that a language could be replaced by another language, that is the fear this way. I mean, if law is entirely linguistic, which it is, that a language could replace another in that way. So this is a good transition point. Now, I'll get back on script now. How do the issues that you've spoken to, and this comes from David Curry's question too, relate to a white supremacist belief system, which is something I think socially that we're starting to talk more about as an issue. So how does it connect to what you're talking about tonight?
Yeah, that is an excellent thread. And I think that the most fascinating thing when you are looking at what changes and how things evolve is which groups are constructed as, quote, white. That whiteness itself has been something that has changed over time. So it is not a given that a certain refugee group would be deemed threatening and dangerous and inassimilable, unable to integrate, but it would be through language that they would be distanced from racial whiteness or made more proximate to racial whiteness. So an example would be the Hungarian refugees from Baltic states. The language about what they would contribute and how hardworking and industrious they were and how they were Western really helped code them as white. And certain groups like Haitians, contrasted with the early waves of Cuban refugees. You could really see in the language the distancing of Haitians. These are clearly non-white, they are threatening, with the elevation of the early waves of Cuban refugees, like, oh, they're like, quote, us, implicitly coded as white. And here's all these words where we might not say white, but we'll say things like hardworking, spiritual, industrious, not at all dependent on government aid, like us, even just things like that.
Yeah.
In 2016, I think the language is more a language of cultural differences, and today as well. So not saying race explicitly, this group is not white, or they're far from being white, but saying they're just so culturally different from the American way of life.
Yeah.
And so it's like a way of being colorblind, but still cueing the same feelings that would come over ethnic and cultural, I guess they're equivocating cultural difference with what you would really see as a racial ethnic difference.
I mean, I feel like when I read about European politics and sort of movements to the right in certain areas, and it feels like a familiar framing that we're going to lose our culture, that this country is going to become something that it wasn't before. And excuse the simplicity of this question. I'm trying to find the right words for it because I feel like it's sensitive, but if you go to another place, you know how people say, you have to learn the language. If you hear speak English, is there any responsibility in that way to adopt or engage with a culture that you move into? I'm not saying that is something that is happening, that people are showing up and refusing to do anything. But is it a responsibility? Probably on a linguistic level, like where you want to connect with people.
Absolutely. For the U.S. refugee resettlement program, language training is part of what's done as integration. And you're right, in the European context, there is that interesting aspect of nostalgia for the past. And I did see American lawmakers have that nostalgia, like, my immigrant grandmother was different than these current refugee groups because, she learned the language and she was hardworking and she wanted to contribute and she wanted to assimilate. And then there's this assumption these groups don't want to do that. Now, if you would look at data or studies of learning language, you would find many of the groups are working very hard to learn the language. I think the other thing to go off your thread, which is really interesting, is what about thinking of it as not one way, right? What about thinking of it as when cultures mix and people mix, that there is a learning that goes in multiple directions, and that we're all sort of influenced by each other, rather than, I think assimilation seems very like one way, like you go to place X, and place X has this like perfect, this is the language place X speaks and the culture and the way of life, and then you adapt to that.
Yeah, that's beautifully put, and thanks for eloquently answering like a roughly framed question. And I think of like a local organization like Literacy Green Bay, and they're teaching people how to speak English so they can thrive in the community. And it's always been funny to me when somebody who is speaking sort of a broken English apologizes to me, and I just make it a point now to say, you speak more languages than I do, like I'm the one that should be embarrassed here, not you. Another question has come in, if you don't mind. So this is from Jessica Van Sloten. And she asks, if language and identity have divided us on the issue of refugee resettlement, how can language and identity bring us together? Are there compelling narratives that help bridge these partisan divides?
Oh, that's a great question. I do think that one thing to keep in mind with that is the very nature of identity is that it's always changing, because it has to be constantly reproduced all the time. We have to reproduce a sense of a self of who we are, and we have to do that through language. So that means that there's always potential for change. And I also think if we look at the Afghan situation, we can see that there is more bipartisan agreement and consensus over certain Afghan refugee groups as being, quote, our allies, our friends. Using language of allies and friends has brought Republicans and Democrats somewhat together, not 100%. So there's potential for change. What I really struggle with a question like that, and I don't know yet, I don't have a coherent way that I'm thinking about it yet, is for so long American exceptionalism and providential exceptionalism was a uniting narrative. And maybe that's a good thing, but then it's also a very toxic narrative. It's very dangerous. So what do we do when something brings us as Americans together, but then it's actually very toxic in how we interact with the rest of the world in terms of superiority or colonial mindset?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I haven't formed a coherent way to grapple with it, but it's something I struggle with.
It's really interesting. So connected to that, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, how does the current withdrawal from Afghanistan connect to what you've described? And I think about that in the framing of, again, if I pick the most simplistic arguments possible, so much so that I wouldn't even call them arguments, that like you should go back to where you came from, or moving for deportation, but we're clearly not, at least in the case of Afghanistan, there's not a structure that we successfully built for people to stay in. So how does that connect to what you're...
Yeah, that is a really tough one, because I think a lot of Americans do feel sympathy and recognize, even among many of our veterans, there was a closeness and a bond and an intimacy where Afghans were side by side, fighting or protecting, translating, putting their lives at risk. And even beyond the translators and interpreters, many Afghans were risking their lives for the, quote, U.S. mission, freedom, and they said human rights and women's rights and all of these things. So now they are in danger, and I think it is a moment where we can see changes possible in identity narratives and refugee resettlement, because there are Republicans like Mitch McConnell, one of the leading political elites for Republican elite cues and how Republican and conservative identity might make sense of what's happening, and he's saying, quote, we owe them. Right?
Yep.
So that's a big deal, and I think that's why it is important to keep looking over time. We can never stop. We have to keep tracking how these things evolve and adapt, and the language we use and how it changes. But I also think you're getting at something really deeper there with what is the U.S. responsibility? What is the culpability-based responsibility that comes with when we are heavily intervening in contexts abroad, and we make or create or contribute to conditions that create unsafe environments long term. What is our responsibility to the people that are then harmed?
Yeah.
That would mean Americans would have to start paying a lot closer attention to foreign policy in order for lawmakers to realize, oh, they're watching and they really care. Not just when there's a war, but in our interventions, in all sorts of places where we create conditions of harm through foreign policy.
So if I pull that apart for a second, going back to the first part, and I really appreciate you referencing what seems to be sort of blips in the partisan narrative, that you're looking for linguistic signals that are on the margins as a beacon that we should latch onto in some way. What do you think is causing that? Is it really sort of the shared responsibility? Is it? Because some people would say that's uncharacteristic. That we're so used to rigid partisan division, but even in Wisconsin, we're trying to resettle people. I want to say Fort McCoy, and even when I first moved to Wisconsin, it was right after Katrina that people in Wisconsin were taking in refugees from New Orleans, if I can use that term, like into their homes. So there's something there. Like why do you think in this instance somebody like Mitch McConnell would say we owe them?
Yeah, it's really amazing. It's fascinating, and I think it goes back to the power of how we represent the groups. If we represent them as friends and allies who were brave and risked their lives, which is the language I'm seeing.
Yeah.
A lot of these policymakers, including Republicans and conservatives, that are in favor of some level of resettlement. And then we can think of them not as Muslim outsiders who are threatening and dangerous, but as friends, as they're like us, they're proximate to you and me. They were willing to give their life fighting alongside my son or my daughter. And then there's also the aspect of, constituent pressure, veterans that pressure lawmakers.
That's interesting, yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna just shift gears a little bit. So what would you say is the United States, and you're speaking to this a little bit, current tone on refugees seeking asylum. Has anything changed from the transition from Trump to the Biden administration? And I don't really ask to differentiate on a partisan level, but it just, going back to the examples you used in the presentation of a more unified thread, it just seems like time is moving faster, that we're changing faster. So what do you see as like our evolution right now in terms of where we are on this?
Yeah,
and this is sort of leading up to me asking a little bit about climate change, but
absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. I think that we can see some big differences right away where Biden wanted to differentiate the Democratic administration from the previous Republican Trump administration, so immediately reversed the travel ban, immediately tried to get rid of Remain in Mexico, which was a policy critiqued by human rights advocates. It was upheld through lawsuits by a federal judge, but he tried, and then raised the refugee ceiling. So real policy changes that would give more people an opportunity to be resettled in the United States. The issue is that we see a lot of continuity with especially violating some refugee protection principles when it comes, for example, to Haitians, as you may have heard about in recent news, that thousands of Haitians were trying to seek asylum. And we have this very complicated thing where we separate asylum seekers on the southern border from, quote, refugees who are abroad, they're overseas, they are resettled through an orderly process that takes years. And when it comes to the southern border and asylum seekers and groups like Central Americans and Haitians, this administration has not really changed from the previous administration. There is a lot of critique of keeping Title 42 in place, which is basically a public health ordinance that because of COVID, there's a ban essentially on people applying for asylum along the southern border that they can just sort of be sent back and said no to. You can't apply for asylum because of this Title 42. So people are pointing out the continuity across Trump and Biden. But when it comes to overseas refugee resettlement, then you can say, yes, the Biden administration is really trying to differentiate itself and say we do want to protect those vulnerable people abroad.
In what ways would you say?
By raising the admissions from what Trump had taken all the way down to about 15,000 per year, up to 125,000 for this coming fiscal year. I mean, so that is just huge in terms of the impact on worldwide availability of places for those people to go to be resettled.
So how would you, I want to ask a little bit about nations as a concept and how that feeds this problem, right, in some way that, so how would you, I think about very simplistic arguments that, for example, we don't have enough space, right, and we clearly do, right, you could drive across the country and see it all. So is human allegiance to nations something that we should rethink a little bit? And I guess in the back of my mind is some, like differing views on the United Nations. Like some people, when I was younger, I never understood why anybody would hate the United Nations as an institution. Like, how could you hate that? What's wrong with this? But is there something to that? Is there a nationalism there that's harmful?
Yeah, it's such a challenging one and a fascinating one. Why do we identify now as national groups when for hundreds of years of human history we really didn't? We identified not at least with a national border, but with like tribal groups, religious affiliations, kingdoms. So this is something relatively recent, that we would say we're a national group and it's linked to this territory, and you can find the lines on the map. If we think of nations as like peoples and cultures, well then of course that kind of group attachment has been around for a very long time. But this idea of border control and defining ourselves as American, Brazilian, that's something new. So if it wasn't always there, will it always be in the future? I think the people that are really pressing against that the hardest are the people that look at transplanetary issues like climate issues or pandemics or migration and see that it doesn't really work well to tackle global problems that cross borders when we just identify ourselves with the borders. There's some really creative work being done, like Paulina Ochoa Espejo has this idea of what if we didn't identify with like the country borders on the map, but with watersheds and environmental spaces.
Yeah.
And we reconceptualized our citizenship as like owing obligations to bodies of water that we need things from, and so we are due to give them some sort of returns. So there are creative ideas for rethinking it that are not national borders, but it's so entrenched. Nationalism is so entrenched and so strong that others would say, you know, it seems like we're really far from people doing that.
I think, in the way that COVID overturned very quickly certain ways that we thought about the world, like I hope that we would remember that that could happen again. And so, in thinking about climate change, so I'm just going to digress a little bit here. And I'm a big science fiction reader, and I recently read this, and so science fiction as a genre is really taking on climate change. There's a lot of, as you would expect, like dystopian works on the future, but this novel is called The Ministry of the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I read it about a month ago, and to me it's almost an invention of a new genre. I would call it a policy novel. It's not written as a narrative, it's really written as policies to like enact change, and some of the main characters are policy figures, right? And so thinking about, when we think about refugees, there's always the language that says you should go back there. I feel like we're moving toward a place where there might not be a there to go back to. So how does climate change, in even the present, near future, how does that, not that this is an easy question, go ahead and tell me how that relates to what you're...
But it's so important, so it's great that you bring it up. I think the first limitation is how we define refugees, both the US law and the international law. They have to be fleeing political persecution, and the climate cannot politically persecute. So we end up in this legal bind where the protections that go with being classified and eligible for refugeehood fall away when we look at climate change. And so many people have said that's a huge limitation because you're right, there are people that will not be able to live literally in the space that they inhabit because of rising sea levels and natural disasters or droughts. So how can we think of these people in a different way, or change the legal definitions, or change international law? Now, in a practical aspect, many countries want to be less tied than ever to international legal obligations.
Right.
But on a regional level, there are countries like in South America and parts of Africa that come together and they redefine refugee to broaden it so that it can take into account climate change issues and climate as a driver. So the issue we have is that people become forcibly displaced from their homes for multiple layers of reasons. And it's really hard to say it's just one thing and it's just political persecution.
I mean, I was thinking about Malcolm X in relation to this, and I had read the most recent biography, and I was really struck by how much he believed in the UN, that was his goal, was to take the plight of African Americans to the UN as a human rights issue, right? And then I really started to understand why a lot of people don't like the UN, right, as a body. So returning back to this novel, The Ministry of the Future, so the way that this plays out is in this, it connects to the question about borders, is that, I'm going to digress a little more, you ready? So I used to think that the concept of world citizenship, there were people who would say, I'm not a citizen of any country, I'm a citizen of the world. And in my head, I would say, that's absolutely crazy. And now I don't really think that way. And my colleague Ryan Martin said the other day that climate change was the thing that he's the most fearful of. And I share that sentiment. So in this book, what they did was they just made all of the refugees, like, they gave them global passports, that they could go settle anywhere that they wanted to. And that seems like almost an outrageous fantasy, like in the present, but are these things that we're going to have to start thinking about? Like, what happens when an entire country becomes uninhabitable?
Absolutely. We are seeing some movements towards that with the island country of Kiribati. I mean, it's going to be covered in water. And a few years ago, the president did sort of a PR effort to bring worldwide attention to it by holding a conference under the ocean, like with underwater cameras, sitting with his ministers at a desk underwater to try, and the UN was also, he gave a big speech at the UN, trying to promote these small countries which often don't have a lot of material power that are the most at risk of climate change effects and displacement from it. I think the issue is that it will go back to the partisan divisions for the United States context, because what I found in my research is a lot of Republican and conservative narratives target in on that and use the phrase globalists to refer to what we would think of as that cosmopolitan.
Yeah, I was going to say that's replaced the word cosmopolitan.
It's a conspiracy, or they want to get rid of borders so that they can have their financial elite agenda and make us subservient to that sort of conspiratorial plot that the globalists have. So that has created a real, narrative, linguistic hurdle for making those kinds of arguments or even having those conversations, I think, with conservative Republican communities, because they will be cued very quickly to say, oh, I know about globalism, and that's one of the greatest threats actually facing America. So that will make it really hard. But if we see climate change worsen and people start to see how it affects their daily or their children's daily lives, maybe there will be room for shifting that. We'll have to see.
So here, I'll ask an impossible question then, I guess, that, I've looked at, when I look at the country over the last decade and, trying to pull threads together that seem separate at times, like militarization of police forces in certain areas and sort of survivalism as a concept that there's a future where nations entrench and we're just going to keep everybody out no matter what it takes, which is a really horrible thing to think about, right? And on the other side of it, there's this more globalist approach where you would need the cooperation of nations and an institution, because institutions get things done. And back to the beginning of your talk here, we're talking about law. And we're going to need institutions to write law, right? They just don't fall out of the sky. So what is most, all right, so solve the world's problems, Alise, are you ready? How do we best deal with what I would say is going to be an increasing, critical refugee crisis?
Yeah.
Not as a country, as a planet.
Yeah, that's a really crucial question, and lots of people do work on that because it is so pressing. Even if people aren't thinking about it every day, you could say they should be, because that is sort of where we are and what's coming. Some people say it needs to be all regional. Have regions develop institutions, like North American solutions to migration within North America. Already African countries have really led the front of that movement to create their own institutions to address things that cross different countries in the African continent. So some people say regionalism is the answer, and that countries can work together and even think of themselves more as a region. The European Union is one. Of course, those are very contested though, right? We have in those societies people that still are very nationalist and reject even regionalism. So not even globalism, but even the European Unionness or African Unionness. So I think that there isn't an easy answer, maybe trying to find where the common ground is. If, at least from my research and from sort of my topic tonight, I think if we can find a way to have conversations that are not using the cues of identity and us and them, if we can find a way to couch the conversations and the dialogue in other language that isn't cueing and I'm your enemy, that's the only way that I think that we could really move forward with what sort of laws and institutions would just be practical for us, to survive. Or even if you think about what's really threatening, if an identity narrative is who threatens us, well, maybe it's climate issues and natural disaster and heart disease and pandemics, but it's hard to make those things into enemies.
Or maybe it's just tough to accept that sometimes people are not your enemy, that there's not an other
Right.
there. So I'm going to ask you for pedagogical tips now, if you don't mind. Changing the way people think, right? To me, it's always been, I've never wanted to change the way people think. I want to change the way people talk. And to me, that sounds like what you're saying. How do you, what are some different ways that we could talk about this to other people, or to ourselves, frankly?
Yeah, and that is a great one. I'm not an expert on the practical application probably of the best phrases to use. I know a lot of people do work on that, but I would say if you could just make it known that you're not actually trying to convince anyone of something or change their mind about something. That's what the research I've read has shown is an important first step, because fact-checking, quote-unquote fact-checking, really doesn't work. So studies have found that that's the opposite way to go, to say, if the identity is this, well, let me give you all these facts, let me give you all this data. That is only going to sometimes entrench the people.
So let me circle back. So let's just take the word refugee, for instance. Will that word itself have utility in the future, or is are there negative connotations? I think it's impossible to hear the term refugee and not think other in some way, even in the most non-judgmental way. Do we need to even move beyond the term refugee and immigrant?
Yeah, there are people that have made the case for saying people who cross borders, people that are just crossing borders. Rebecca Hamlin has a new book called Crossing, and she's really making that case that the distinction between refugee and migrant is so problematic and so flawed for not only legal reasons, but reasons of who these people are and how we say this person is up here on the hierarchy of deserving protection and this person is here on that hierarchy. So if we could think of them as just people who cross borders, or mobility, people move. Increasingly in the world, people will be moving a lot for jobs and natural disasters and for safety, and sort of normalizing movement.
And mobility seems to be a word, connotatively, that we support, that we want people to have upward social mobility, right? Whereas borders could be a word that we might rethink in some way. And so I just want to ask one more thing. And so I have the place we started was what brought you to this. So can I ask you where you're going? What are the things that you want to do with this issue, this topic that is really important?
Yeah, thank you. This is a wonderful discussion, and I think that I'm really interested in how the local and local identity connects with the global. And I think it's getting at some of the things you're pointing to, of where are we headed and what are the possibilities for reconceptualizing how people think of themselves and identify. So I'm starting to look now in my current research projects at how local responses to refugee resettlement, how they are contesting international norms, or even localizing and adapting them, saying, look, this is part of the Wisconsinite identity to help people in need. And so we make it a Wisconsin thing to resettle and accept and welcome refugees. I've seen a lot of it in Utah, for example, or lawmakers in Indiana saying, we as Hoosiers, this is what we do, we help people when times are tough.
I still don't know what a Hoosier is. I gotta look
right. So I'm really interested in going even below the national and looking at the local now to see how local and global it's actually mutually constitutive, and that would sort of go in that direction.
So you've forced me to lie, that it wasn't my last question then. And so a phrase that I really like, and I'm not sure I understand it fully, but that the local is global. And I think about our community, how the demographics of where we live are changing in really wonderful ways. What does that phrase mean to you, the local is global? Is it?
Oh, it can be a tricky phrase. I think people mean different things when they're using it, to be honest. Some people, I think,
I'm going to dial it back now from now. I won't say it as much.
Well, no, I think that it just depends, what you're trying to convey, but some people write about it as, we all are in this together, and so global things like pandemics or climate issues or migration really plays out every day in local communities. So you can't really separate the global from the local. I think other people mean the local is always interpreting things that are global and giving meaning to the global. So what is the global? It's if you just take all these little jurisdictions in government, right? They all start at a local jurisdiction where people create meaning around what's a refugee or what are we threatened by. And then the lawmakers, keep going up the hierarchy of jurisdictions. So some people would mean that we can't really say global versus local because the global is a bunch of locals always making the meaning of what global is every day.
A bunch of locals. I like it. Yeah. Alise, I just want to thank you so much for just taking the time and spending it with us and talking about things that you care about. I really appreciate it. And if you will let me read one thing on the way out. And so if you liked what you heard tonight, our next edition of No Reservations will feature 2 guests. So we'll be trying something new. We'll have to find more chairs. And that will be Doctors Sawa Senzaki and Jason Cowell, whose event is called Emotion in Action, Cultural Differences in Parental Socialization of the Moral Brain. I want to know what the moral brain is. You can access the No Reservations series at the Weidner Center's YouTube page and at causeeffect.org. And again, thank you to the Weidner Center, Kelly Strickland and her staff. And thanks for joining us. And Alise, this was really great. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all.